The glow of the MacBook screen was the only light in the heavy, antique-filled study. Outside, the Florence rain battered the 16th-century glass. Dorian had only opened Zinnia's laptop to find a missing tax document for their estate. Instead, hidden behind a dual-encrypted folder, he found a Cayman Islands offshore account. He stared at the numbers. 2 million euros. But it wasn't the staggering sum that made the air evaporate from his lungs. It was the recurring wire transfers to a private studio in San Frediano. The studio of Florentine, the brilliant, brooding young painter Dorian had personally discovered and mentored. In a single, suffocating heartbeat, the perfect geometry of Dorian's high society marriage collapsed. She wasn't just sleeping with his protégé, they were financing a lie right under his nose. If tales of beautiful facades crumbling into dark, calculated vengeance speak to you, pour a glass of wine, settle in, and stay with me. The rain over Florence always felt different than the rain in New York. It was heavier, older, carrying the scent of damp terracotta and centuries of buried secrets. Dorian sat at the massive oak desk in his study, the only source of light emanating from the sleek, silver screen of his wife's MacBook. Zinnia was asleep upstairs in their sprawling villa on the hills of Fiesole. She had left her laptop open on the kitchen island, a rare oversight for a woman whose life was curated with the precision of a museum director. Dorian had only needed to retrieve a PDF of their estate taxes for his accountant. He hadn't meant to pry. He wasn't a jealous man. 10 years of marriage to a woman as stunning and formidable as Zinnia had built an unshakable foundation of trust. Or so he had believed. When the tax folder wouldn't open, Dorian had clicked into the system settings, looking for a misrouted file. Instead, he stumbled upon a partition in the hard drive, a hidden vault. It took him 3 tries to guess the password, the date of her first major gallery acquisition, not their anniversary. The screen blinked, loading a web interface for a private wealth management firm in the Cayman Islands. Dorian leaned in, his brow furrowing. The balance at the top of the screen read 2,450,000 euros. His first thought was panic. Had she been embezzling from the trust? Was she in trouble? But as his eyes traced the ledger of recent transactions, the cold fingers of dread wrapped around his throat. May 12th. Wire transfer, 50,000 euros. Recipient, F. Rossi. June 3rd. Wire transfer, 75,000 euros. Recipient, F. Rossi. August 14th. Wire transfer, 100,000 euros. Recipient, F. Rossi. F. Rossi. Florentine Rossi. Dorian's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound in the quiet room. Florentine, the 26-year-old prodigy. The brooding, immensely talented painter Dorian had plucked from obscurity in a drafty San Frediano studio 2 years ago. Dorian had written the essays that launched Florentine's career. Dorian had introduced him to the buyers. Dorian had invited him into his home. His hand trembled as he clicked on a subfolder labeled Archivio. It wasn't just bank statements. It was an encrypted messaging log. Zinnia, the idiot is going to Milan on Tuesday. Come to the villa at 8. Florentine, I need you. And I need more lead white for the masterpiece. Zinnia, you'll have both. Just make sure the aging process on the canvas is perfect. If he authenticates this one, we retire to the Amalfi Coast. Just you and me. The words blurred together as a sickening wave of nausea washed over him. The idiot. That was him. The globally revered art critic, the man whose single word could make or break a gallery, reduced to a blind fool in his own home. They weren't just sharing a bed. They were sharing a monumental crime. The masterpiece they were referring to had to be the rumored, undocumented Botticelli sketch Zinnia claimed to have sourced from a bankrupt aristocratic family in Siena. She had asked Dorian to do the official appraisal next month. They were using his reputation to authenticate a forgery. They were going to steal millions, destroy his life's work, and then run away together. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked. Zinnia was waking up. Dorian didn't slam the laptop shut. He didn't scream. A strange, terrifying calm descended upon him, chilling his blood to ice. He meticulously closed the windows, cleared the cache, and placed the laptop exactly where he had found it. He walked to the window, looking out at the glittering lights of the ancient city. They thought he was a fool. They thought he was merely a dusty academic, easily manipulated by a beautiful wife and a charismatic protege. You want to play with masterpieces, Zinnia? Dorian whispered to the rain-streaked glass. Let me show you how a true artist works. The dining room of the Fiesole Villa was bathed in the warm, amber glow of a massive Murano chandelier. Beneath its cascading crystals, the mahogany table was a landscape of roasted pheasant, truffled risotto, and half-empty bottles of vintage Barolo. To the 8 distinguished guests, gallery owners, curators, and wealthy collectors, it was another flawless evening hosted by Florence's premier art couple. To Dorian, it was a theater of the grotesque. At the far end of the table, Zinnia held court. She wore a backless emerald silk gown that draped over her shoulders like liquid glass, her laughter ringing out like a silver bell. She was the picture of the devoted, intellectually stimulating wife. Yet, every time she tilted her head, Dorian's eyes tracked the subtle, almost imperceptible shift of her gaze toward the middle of the table. Toward Florentine. The young painter sat slumped in his antique chair, exuding an air of cultivated boredom. He wore a dark, unbuttoned linen shirt that contrasted sharply with the tailored tuxedos of the other men. He was drinking Dorian's wine, eating Dorian's food, and casually swirling a silver goblet with the very hands that had been dissecting Dorian's life. The modern art market is utterly devoid of soul, an elderly British collector across from Florentine declared, waving a fork. We need a return to the masters, to genuine passion. Passion is easily fabricated, Lord Hayes, Florentine murmured, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that always seemed to captivate a room. If the brushstrokes are confident enough, the eye will believe whatever the canvas tells it. Dorian felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. The audacity of the boy was staggering. He was openly mocking the foundation of Dorian's career, authenticity, right to his face. A cynical view, but perhaps a necessary one for a young artist. Dorian chimed in, his tone impossibly smooth, dripping with paternal indulgence. Though I would argue that true authenticity leaves a residue, a psychological fingerprint that no forgery can replicate. Don't you agree, darling? He looked directly at Zinnia. For a fraction of a second, the silver bell of her laughter caught in her throat. A microscopic tightening around her eyes betrayed a flicker of anxiety, quickly buried beneath a radiant, practiced smile. Of course, Dorian, she purred, leaning forward to pass a crystal dish of olives down the table. As she stretched out her arm, the dish moved from her elegant, manicured hands to Florentine's paint-stained fingers. For a passing moment, their skin brushed. It was a mundane interaction to anyone else, but to Dorian, who was suddenly fluent in the language of their treason, it was deafening. He saw the slight pressure of Florentine's thumb against her wrist. He saw the way Zinnia's chest rose in a sharp, quiet inhalation. It was an intimacy born of dark, shared secrets. A silent confirmation of the text Dorian had read. Beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, Dorian's hands curled into tight fists, his nails biting into his palms until the skin threatened to break. The urge to stand up, to shatter his wine glass against the exposed brick wall, and to drag them both into the pouring rain was a roaring fire in his chest. He wanted to scream the truth until the crystal chandelier shattered. But if he burned the house down now, they would merely walk away from the ashes. Zinnia would hire the best lawyers, spin a narrative of a paranoid, aging husband, and quietly delete the Cayman Islands offshore accounts. Florentine would take his youth and talent elsewhere, leaving Dorian as the bitter, discarded relic. Dorian took a slow, measured sip of his Barolo, letting the bitter tannins coat his tongue. He unclenched his fists and smiled warmly at the table. He would let them paint their masterpiece of lies. He would give them all the rope they needed, until the moment they proudly hung themselves with it. The cobblestone streets of San Frediano were slick with the morning damp, the Arno River exhaling a cold, gray mist over the city. Florentine's studio was a cavernous space on the ground floor of a former silk factory, hidden away in a labyrinth of narrow alleys. When Dorian pushed open the heavy iron door, the bell above it announced his arrival with a sharp, metallic clang. Florentine stood in the center of the room, shirtless, wiping a streak of crimson paint from his collarbone with a rag. He froze as Dorian stepped into the harsh, industrial light. "Dorian, an unexpected honor," Florentine said, his voice tight, lacking its usual arrogant drawl. Dorian smiled, leaning elegantly on his silver-tipped cane. "I was in the neighborhood visiting a restorer. I thought I would drop in and see how your new abstract series is coming along." As Dorian stepped deeper into the studio, his senses went to work. The air was thick with the harsh tang of turpentine and linseed oil. But underneath the chemical bite, woven into the very fabric of the room, was something else. Santal 33. The smoky, leathery sandalwood fragrance that Zinnia imported from Paris. It lingered heavily near the velvet sofa in the corner. Dorian's stomach twisted into a violent knot, but his face remained a mask of serene, aristocratic curiosity. "The modern pieces are over here," Florentine said quickly, gesturing to a row of large, chaotic canvases leaning against the brick wall. Dorian drifted toward them, offering polite, intellectual praise about composition and negative space. Yet, his trained eyes were relentlessly scanning the periphery of the studio. It did not take long for his gaze to snag on a makeshift partition of frosted glass in the back corner. Through the blur, he could make out the silhouette of a heavy wooden workbench, distinctly separate from Florentine's usual easel, illuminated by an intense, unnatural heat lamp. Feigning interest in a charcoal sketch pinned to a nearby pillar, Dorian casually strolled past the partition. He glanced around the edge. There, half hidden beneath a stained canvas drop cloth, was a collection of tools that had no business in a contemporary painter's studio. Dorian saw a heavy marble mortar and pestle crusted with a pale, dense powder. Bianco di Piombo, lead white. Not the modern, synthetic titanium white artists use today, but raw, toxic lead carbonate. The exact, heavily restricted compound Renaissance masters used for underpainting. Next to it sat a small vial of dried rabbit skin glue, a bundle of badger hair blending brushes, and a jar of ground lapis lazuli. It was an absurdly expensive, historically accurate pigment, entirely unnecessary for a struggling abstract artist, but absolutely vital if one were forging a 15th-century Madonna's robes. Most damning of all was a small, temperature-controlled baking oven used to rapidly age varnishes, forcing artificial craquelure, the web of fine cracks, onto fresh paint. "Experimenting with traditional methods, are we?" Dorian asked, his voice a masterclass in casual observation. He pointed the ferrule of his cane toward the mortar. Florentine stepped quickly into Dorian's line of sight, blocking the workbench. A bead of sweat formed at his temple despite the chill in the studio. "Just studying the old masters. Trying to understand their layering techniques. It helps with the texture of my modern work." "Fascinating," Dorian murmured softly. He met the young man's eyes, allowing a heavy, pregnant silence to stretch between them. Florentine's dark eyes darted nervously. For a breathless second, the air in the studio grew dangerously thin. The young artist was searching Dorian's face for any sign of accusation, any crack in the older man's blind composure. Dorian offered him a warm, patronizing smile, patting Florentine's bare shoulder. "There is nothing quite like the genuine article, is there? The way history breathes through the right materials. I look forward to seeing how these studies influence your future, my boy." The tension dissolved instantly. Florentine exhaled, a smug, contemptuous smirk returning to his lips. He truly believed he was outsmarting the master. "Thank you, Dorian," Florentine said, his confidence restored. "I promise, my next piece will be a revelation." "I have no doubt it will," Dorian replied, turning toward the door. As he stepped back out into the cold Florentine morning, the scent of his wife's perfume clung to his wool coat, a sickening reminder of the intimacy he had just stood inside. But the blinding grief was gone, replaced entirely by the cold, surgical precision of a man who had just found the murder weapon. The game was no longer a digital theory. It was made of canvas, lead, and blood. The heavy oak doors of the Trust's private viewing room swung shut with a definitive thud, sealing Dorian and Zinnia inside a space designed for silence and secrets. The room, lined with black velvet and illuminated by precisely calibrated, daylight-balanced spotlights, smelled faintly of aged paper and Zinnia's signature, Santal 33. In the center of the room, resting on a padded easel, sat a large, flat package wrapped in unbleached linen. Zinnia stood beside it, her posture rigid with an anxiety she tried desperately to mask beneath a veneer of professional excitement. She wore a tailored black suit that made her look both formidable and fragile, her dark hair pulled back into a severe chignon. "The Sienese family finally released it this morning," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They were terrified of the Italian Ministry of Culture seizing it for back taxes, but I managed the paperwork. It's undocumented, Dorian. Completely off the grid." Dorian remained seated in his leather armchair, steepled fingers resting beneath his chin. He let the silence stretch, watching a pulse flutter rapidly at the base of his wife's throat. She was a brilliant estate manager, a master of provenance and legal loopholes, but she was not an actor. The desperation clinging to her was palpable. "Show me," he said softly, his tone betraying nothing but scholarly anticipation. With trembling hands, Zinnia carefully peeled back the linen, exposing the heavy, ornate frame, and finally, the canvas itself. It was a depiction of Saint Catherine of Siena, her face turned upward in ecstatic devotion, bathed in a soft, ethereal light. The colors were muted, the lapis lazuli robes deep and melancholic, the flesh tones pale and luminous. The surface was webbed with the fine, delicate craquelure that only centuries of expanding and contracting wood could produce. To the untrained eye of a billionaire collector, it was a breathtaking, lost masterpiece by Sandro Botticelli. To Dorian, it was a magnificent, grotesque lie. He rose slowly from his chair, reaching for the magnifying loupe resting on the velvet-lined table beside him. As he approached the painting, he felt Zinnia step back, giving him space, her breath held tight in her chest. Dorian leaned in, bringing the lens mere inches from the canvas. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating. He saw it all. The forced aging of the varnish in Florentine's oven had created cracks that were slightly too uniform, lacking the organic, chaotic splintering of true antiquity. The lead white underpainting, while chemically accurate, lacked the subtle, almost translucent depth of 15th century layering. It was applied with the impatient, heavy-handed confidence of a modern artist. The brushstrokes in the saint's halo, though masterful, betrayed a microscopic hesitation, a deliberate imitation rather than a spontaneous creation. It was Florentine's hand, unmistakably. The arrogant, sweeping strokes of a young man trying to wear the skin of a god. "Well," Zinnia whispered, the single word trembling in the air. Dorian slowly lowered the loupe. He turned to face his wife, his expression unreadable. He saw the woman he had loved for a decade, the woman whose intelligence and ambition he had worshipped, standing before him, begging him to unknowingly slit his own throat. She needed his name. His reputation was the alchemy that would turn this worthless piece of painted wood into 2 million euros. He stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out to gently cup her cheek. He felt the cold sweat on her skin. He let his thumb brush against her cheekbone, a gesture of profound, heartbreaking tenderness. "My dear," Dorian murmured, his voice thick with a genuine, agonizing emotion that Zinnia entirely misinterpreted as awe. "You have found something truly extraordinary." Zinnia let out a sharp, shuddering breath, her eyes fluttering shut in sheer relief. A brilliant, triumphant smile broke across her face as she leaned into his touch. "I knew it," she breathed. "I knew you would see it." "It is a masterpiece," Dorian lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The composition, the use of light. It is undeniably from the master's workshop. Perhaps even the master himself. It is flawless, Zinnia." He dropped his hand, turning back to the forgery. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. He had just given his wife the weapon she needed to destroy him. and she had smiled as he handed it to her. The library of the trust was lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound volumes, centuries of art history, silent witnesses to the transaction about to occur. Dust motes danced in the slanted shafts of afternoon sunlight that cut across the heavy mahogany desk. Dorian sat in his high-backed leather chair, a pristine sheet of cream-colored, watermarked parchment resting before him. It was the official certificate of authenticity, bearing the embossed seal of the Zinnia and Dorian Art Estate Trust. Zinnia stood opposite him, leaning slightly forward, her hands resting flat on the polished wood. She was perfectly composed today, dressed in a sharp, slate-gray blazer, the picture of a consummate professional finalizing a monumental acquisition. But Dorian could see the faint tremor in her fingertips, the rigid tension in her jaw. She was vibrating with a suppressed, electric anticipation. The Sienese family is anxious for the finalized paperwork, Zinnia said, her voice smooth, though slightly breathless. They have an interested buyer in Geneva ready to wire the funds to our escrow account the moment they receive your signature. Dorian picked up his Montblanc fountain pen, its gold nib gleaming in the light. He unscrewed the cap with slow, deliberate movements, the metallic snick echoing loudly in the quiet room. He stared at the document. This single sheet of paper held the sum total of his life's work. 30 years of meticulous study, countless hours in damp archives, his unimpeachable integrity, the reputation that commanded the respect of every major museum in the world. All of it was distilled into the ink that would soon flow from his pen. By signing this document, he was endorsing a lie. He was transforming a worthless piece of forged canvas into a multi-million-euro masterpiece. And in doing so, he was knowingly destroying his own legacy. He felt a sudden, suffocating weight pressed down on his chest. A profound, hollow grief washed over him, not just for the wife who had betrayed him, but for the man he had been, the scholar who believed in the sanctity of truth and the enduring power of genuine art. That man was about to die, murdered by the stroke of his own pen. He looked up at Zinnia. Her eyes, usually so sharp and analytical, were wide with a hungry, desperate plea. She needed this. She needed his blind trust to fund her escape with her young, arrogant lover. She had used his love for her as the ultimate tool of his destruction. It is a heavy responsibility, validating a piece of this magnitude, Dorian murmured, his voice low, testing the waters of her guilt. Once this seal is affixed, it becomes absolute truth in the eyes of the world. There is no room for error, Zinnia. For a fleeting second, a shadow crossed her face. A flicker of hesitation, perhaps even a whisper of remorse, darkened her eyes before it was ruthlessly squashed. Her jaw set with determination. There is no error, Dorian, she replied, her voice steady and reassuring. You saw the underpainting yourself. The craquelure. The provenance is watertight, despite the family's previous secrecy. It is a Botticelli. She reached out, her cool hand gently covering his where it gripped the pen. You are the greatest mind in Renaissance art, she said, her voice dropping to a soft, intimate register. No one else could have recognized its true value. This is your triumph as much as it is theirs. Her touch felt like cold iron against his skin. He did not pull away. Instead, he met her gaze with a calm, unreadable intensity. He let her believe she had manipulated him perfectly, let her feel the thrill of absolute power over him. Very well, Dorian whispered. He withdrew his hand from beneath hers, lowered the gold nib to the parchment, and signed his name with a fluid, practiced flourish. He then reached for the heavy brass stamp beside the inkwell, pressed it firmly onto a pool of hot red wax at the bottom of the page, and sealed the document. The sound of the stamp hitting the desk was a final, deafening crack in the silence. It was done. The point of no return had been crossed. Zinnia exhaled a long, shuddering breath, a brilliant smile breaking across her face as she carefully picked up the certificate. I will have this couriered to Geneva immediately, she said, turning toward the door, her steps light and eager. Zinnia, Dorian called out softly. She paused, looking back over her shoulder. Ensure the transport for the gala is flawless, he said, his eyes tracking her every movement. We wouldn't want anything to happen to our masterpiece before the world sees it. I'll handle everything, she promised, stepping out into the hallway. Dorian sat alone in the library, staring at the empty space on his desk. He wiped the excess ink from his pen, a cold, empty satisfaction settling in his gut. The trap was locked. Now, it was time to build the guillotine. The high-speed train from Florence to Rome cut through the Tuscan countryside, blurring the rolling hills into streaks of gold and green. Dorian sat in the first-class carriage, sipping espresso, his tailored charcoal suit a stark contrast to the dark, chaotic errand that had brought him south. He had told Zinnia he was attending a private viewing of a Caravaggio collection at the Borghese Gallery, a lie she had accepted with the distracted ease of a woman whose mind was already in the Amalfi Coast. He arrived at Termini Station and immediately hailed a taxi, directing the driver away from the polished piazzas and marble fountains, deep into the grimy, graffiti-scarred labyrinth of Trastevere. The address he sought belonged to a man named Matteo Vane. 10 years ago, Matteo had been a rising star in the Restoration world, until a scandalous scandal involving stolen Vatican artifacts and a severe gambling addiction had permanently exiled him to the black market. Dorian found the studio down a narrow alley smelling of stale wine and wet garbage. He knocked firmly on the splintering wooden door. It swung open to reveal a cramped, chaotic room littered with empty bottles, half-finished canvases, and the overpowering stench of cheap cigarettes. Matteo, a gaunt man with frantic, bloodshot eyes and hands stained permanently with cadmium red, stood in the doorway, staring at the immaculate figure of the famous art critic. "Signor Dorian," Matteo rasped, wiping his mouth with the back of a trembling hand. "To what do I owe the honor of a visit from the Pope of the Florentine art world?" "I need a commission, Matteo," Dorian said softly, stepping into the foul-smelling room without waiting for an invitation. "And I need it done in 3 days." He withdrew a large, thick manila envelope from his briefcase and tossed it onto a cluttered table. Inside were high-resolution photographs Dorian had secretly taken of the forged Botticelli, along with detailed dimensions. Matteo picked up the photos, his eyes widening. "This is magnificent. But this isn't my work. I copy, I don't create." "I don't want you to create it," Dorian replied, his voice cold and precise. "I want you to butcher it." Matteo looked up, confusion warring with greed in his sunken eyes. "Butcher it? I want a replica of this piece," Dorian instructed, stepping closer. "But it must be an absolute, undeniable abomination. I want the proportions of the saint's face to be slightly elongated, almost comical. I want the lapis lazuli robes to be painted with the cheapest, most synthetic acrylic blue you can find. I want the craquelure to look like it was drawn on with a ballpoint pen. It must be so obviously, grotesquely fake that a first-year art student would laugh at it." Matteo stared at him, bewildered. "You want me to paint a cartoon of a masterpiece? Why? That is none of your concern," Dorian said smoothly. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a thick stack of euros, tossing them beside the photographs. 20,000 now. Another 30 when it is delivered to a specific address in Florence." Matteo's eyes locked onto the cash. The trembling in his hands ceased momentarily. He licked his dry lips. "And if I decide that your unusual request is worth more than 50,000? Your reputation is worth millions, Dorian." Dorian didn't blink. He leaned forward, the patrician mask slipping just enough to reveal the cold, terrifying abyss beneath. "If you breathe a word of this to anyone, Matteo, I won't just ruin your non-existent career. I will ensure the Carabinieri receive an anonymous tip about the 3 lost Modiglianis currently sitting in the basement of that gallery in Milan. The ones you painted last year." Matteo's face drained of color. He swallowed hard, stepping back from the table. 3 days, he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can do it." "Excellent," Dorian said, his tone returning to polite indifference. He turned toward the door. "Make it ugly, Matteo. Make it scream." As he stepped back out into the Roman heat, Dorian felt a twisted sense of accomplishment. The brushstrokes of his revenge were finally on the canvas. He had just commissioned the weapon that would publicly, spectacularly execute the woman he loved and the protege he had raised. The destruction of his own world was proceeding exactly on schedule. The subterranean loading dock of the Sterling building in central Florence was a fortress of concrete and fluorescent light. It was 2 days before the gala. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and anticipation. Dorian sat in the back of his chauffeured Mercedes, parked discreetly behind a concrete pillar, watching the armored transport van idle near the service elevator. Zinnia had hired Aegis Art Security, the best in Europe, to move the masterpiece from the Trust's vault to the exhibition space upstairs. She had been meticulous, overseeing the packing of the crate herself that morning, her eyes bright with the thrill of the impending payout. She was currently upstairs in the gallery, directing the lighting technicians, completely unaware that her husband was systematically dismantling her perfect crime beneath her feet. Dorian checked his Patek Philippe watch. 2:14 p.m. Beside him on the plush leather seat sat a large, unmarked wooden crate, identical in dimensions to the one currently being loaded into the van. Inside it rested Matteo Vane's abomination, a crude, gaudy cartoon of St. Catherine that smelled faintly of cheap acrylics and malice. At 2:15 p.m., Dorian's phone buzzed. A text from his private investigator. Fire alarm pulled on the 3rd floor. Protocol initiated. Dorian watched through the tinted window as the blare of the building's emergency sirens echoed through the loading dock. The heavy steel fire doors began to automatically descend. The 2 armed Aegis guards, strictly adhering to protocol, immediately locked the transport van and jogged toward the designated secure muster point near the exit ramp, leaving the vehicle unattended for a mandatory 3-minute sweep. Dorian moved with a speed and fluidity that belied his age. He stepped out of the Mercedes, signaling his driver, a man fiercely loyal to Dorian and generously compensated for his sudden blindness. The driver hauled the unmarked crate from the trunk and followed Dorian to the van. Dorian produced a cloned digital keycard, a minor expense from a contact in Milan, and swiped it against the van's rear door sensor. The lock clicked open with a soft, electronic sigh. Inside the dimly lit cargo hold, the genuine forgery sat securely strapped to a padded dolly. It was the physical manifestation of his wife's betrayal, the canvas that had funded her secret life with Florentine. For a fraction of a second, Dorian felt a surge of violent rage, a desire to take a box cutter and shred the canvas into 1,000 useless ribbons right then and there. But destruction in the dark was too merciful. He needed them to burn in the light. "Switch it," Dorian commanded quietly. His driver swiftly unbuckled the straps, hoisted the forged Botticelli, and carried it back to the trunk of the Mercedes. In its place, he slid Matteo's heavy, grotesque replica onto the dolly, securing the straps exactly as they had been. Dorian stepped back, his heart hammering a heavy, steady rhythm against his ribs. He closed the van doors, ensuring the electronic lock re-engaged perfectly. He was back in the plush, climate-controlled silence of his Mercedes just as the fire alarm abruptly ceased and the heavy steel doors began to rise. The 2 Aegis guards returned, sweeping the area with their eyes, completely oblivious to the fact that they were now guarding a worthless piece of garbage. They climbed into the cab and drove the van toward the service elevator, carrying Dorian's Trojan horse directly into the heart of Zinnia's exhibition. Dorian leaned his head against the cool leather headrest, exhaling a long, slow breath. The physical mechanism of his revenge was in place. The genuine forgery was safely locked in his trunk, destined for an incinerator. All that remained was the performance. He closed his eyes, picturing the moment the velvet cloth would be pulled away in front of Florence's elite, and allowed himself a thin, chilling smile. The air inside the Fiesole villa was heavy with the scent of white lilies and anticipation. It was the night before the unveiling. Tomorrow evening, the world would see the lost Botticelli, and the following morning, the €2 million wire transfer from Geneva would clear. Dorian sat by the massive stone fireplace in the drawing room, a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25 resting on his knee. The fire cast long, dancing shadows across the Persian rug, illuminating the subtle gray at his temples and the exhausted, impenetrable calm in his eyes. Zinnia swept into the room, radiating a frantic, incandescent energy. She wore a simple silk slip dress, her bare feet silent on the floorboards, a flute of champagne dangling from her fingertips. She looked younger tonight, stripped of her sharp blazers and curated professional armor. She looked like a woman standing on the precipice of a new, unimaginably wealthy life. A life with Florentine. The gallery is secure. Aegis confirmed the crate is in the vault room, ready for tomorrow's mounting, she announced, practically vibrating as she sank onto the plush leather sofa opposite him. She took a long, celebratory sip of champagne. The press RSVPs are finalized. The Times, Le Monde, Illinois Courier, everyone is coming. Dorian. It is a monumental discovery, Dorian replied smoothly, his voice a low, comforting rumble. A career-defining moment. For both of us. Zinnia smiled, a brilliant, blinding expression that used to make Dorian's heart stumble. Now, it only made his stomach churn with a cold, clinical disgust. She set her glass down and moved across the space between them, kneeling gracefully on the rug at his feet. She rested her chin on his knee, looking up at him with wide, shining eyes. I couldn't have done this without you, she whispered, her voice thick with a counterfeit sincerity that made his skin crawl. Your authentication, it means everything. It validates everything I've worked for. Dorian looked down at her, studying the familiar curve of her jaw, the dark, intelligent depths of her eyes. He saw the woman he had married, the brilliant, ruthless partner who had helped him build an empire. And he saw the architect of his total humiliation. You've always been exceptionally driven, my dear, Dorian said, reaching out to gently stroke her hair, his fingers threading through the dark strands with a detached, methodical precision. You possess a unique talent for seeing the value in things that others overlook. Like Florentine, she murmured, an involuntary softening in her voice at the boy's name. She caught herself immediately, her eyes darting away for a fraction of a second before returning to his face with a practiced, loving gaze. You discovered him, but I always knew he had a role to play in our legacy. Dorian's hand stilled in her hair. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it. She was practically flaunting the affair in his face, emboldened by the belief that she had already won. She thought he was a blind, doddering fool, stroking the head of the snake that was about to strike. He does, indeed, have a profound role in tomorrow's events, Dorian agreed, his voice a silken thread pulled taut over a razor blade. More than he could possibly imagine. Zinnia leaned up, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to his cheek. We're going to be legends, Dorian. After tomorrow, everything changes. Yes, Dorian whispered against her hair, his eyes fixed on the dying embers in the fireplace, watching them crumble into gray, lifeless dust. Tomorrow, everything burns. He pulled her into an embrace, holding her tight against his chest, listening to the steady, deceptive rhythm of her heart. He was holding a ghost. The woman in his arms had died the night he opened her laptop. Tomorrow, the world would attend her funeral. The grand hall of the Palazzo Vecchio was a symphony of wealth and whispered influence. Beneath the soaring, frescoed ceilings, Florence's elite, billionaire collectors from Geneva, sharp-eyed critics from London, and the old-money aristocracy of Tuscany, mingled in a sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns. The air hummed with a palpable, electric energy, fueled by crystal flutes of Dom Perignon and the irresistible allure of a lost masterpiece. Dorian stood near the towering arched windows, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, a picture of aristocratic calm. He wore a midnight blue velvet dinner jacket, his silver hair swept back impeccably. Beside him, Zinnia was a vision of radiant, nervous energy in a backless, crimson silk gown that clung to her like a second skin. She was holding court with a group of Parisian curators, her laughter brittle and bright. Across the marble floor, leaning casually against a 16th-century marble column, was Florentine. He looked remarkably out of place among the established titans of the art world, yet entirely comfortable in his arrogance. He wore a sharp, minimalist black suit with no tie, his dark hair falling effortlessly over his forehead. He was swirling a glass of bourbon, watching Zinnia with a heavy, hooded gaze that was entirely too intimate for a public setting. Every few minutes, his eyes would dart toward the center of the room. There, bathed in the harsh, focused beams of 4 overhead spotlights, stood a massive, heavy oak easel. Resting upon it was a large canvas, draped entirely in a thick, black velvet cloth. 2 armed Aegis security guards flanked it, their faces impassive. It was the altar upon which Dorian was about to sacrifice his life's work. "You look remarkably serene for a man about to rewrite art history," Dorian, a raspy voice observed. Dorian turned to see Lord Hayes, the elderly British collector from their dinner party, leaning heavily on a silver-topped cane. His eyes were sharp, evaluating the velvet-draped easel with naked hunger. "History is rarely rewritten in a single stroke, Arthur," Dorian replied softly, his voice carrying easily over the din of the string quartet playing in the gallery's alcove. "It usually requires a profound, unsettling revelation. I believe tonight will provide exactly that." Lord Hayes chuckled, a dry, papery sound. "I hear the Siamese family is demanding €2 million. If your authentication is as flawless as your wife claims, they'll have it wired by morning." "I assure you, Arthur," Dorian said, his gaze drifting across the room to where Zinnia and Florentine had momentarily caught each other's eye, a silent, triumphant exchange passing between them. "The value of what is beneath that cloth will be unequivocally established tonight." Zinnia detached herself from the Parisians and glided over to Dorian, sliding her arm through his. Her skin was flushed, radiating heat through the velvet of his jacket. "It's time," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly with the sheer, intoxicating thrill of the grift. "The press photographers are in position." Dorian patted her hand, a gesture of hollow, paternal comfort. "Then let us not keep the world waiting, my dear." He offered his arm, and together, the golden couple of the Florence art scene began their slow, deliberate walk toward the center of the hall. The string quartet abruptly ceased playing. A hush fell over the crowd, a collective holding of breath as the hundreds of guests pressed forward, their eyes locked on the black velvet cloth. As they reached the stage, Florentine materialized from the crowd, taking his place discreetly at the edge of the platform. He shot Dorian a tight, respectful nod, the dutiful protégé honoring his master's grand moment. Dorian met the young man's eyes, holding the gaze for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The silence in the Palazzo Vecchio was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence before the guillotine blade drops. Dorian stepped up to the microphone, his hands resting lightly on the podium, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm of pure, unadulterated ice. The microphone echoed slightly in the cavernous, fresco-lined hall of the Palazzo Vecchio. Dorian's voice, a resonant baritone honed by decades of university lectures and gallery openings, rolled over the silent, expectant crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues," Dorian began, his gaze sweeping over the sea of rapt faces, lingering momentarily on the sleek, black camera lenses of the International Press Corps. "Tonight, we are gathered to witness a resurrection. For centuries, the true scope of Sandro Botticelli's genius has been hidden in private collections, veiled by time and the heavy dust of history. The piece before you has survived the ravages of war, the capriciousness of aristocrats, and the sheer weight of obscurity." Beside the easel, Zinnia stood rigid, a strained, brilliant smile plastered across her face. Her hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. A few feet away, Florentine leaned against a marble pillar, swirling his bourbon, a smirk playing on his lips, the very picture of a young conqueror surveying his kingdom. "My wife, the incomparable Zinnia, has worked tirelessly to bring this artifact into the light," Dorian continued, turning to gesture gracefully toward her. The crowd murmured appreciatively. "It is her vision, her relentless pursuit of provenance, that has orchestrated this evening, and it is my distinct honor to finally show it to you." Dorian stepped away from the podium. He walked slowly toward the heavy oak easel, the beams of the 4 spotlights crossing over him like the crosshairs of a rifle. He reached out and grasped the edge of the black velvet cloth. He looked directly at Zinnia. Her eyes were wide, shining with raw, naked greed and the thrill of absolute victory. She gave him a microscopic, encouraging nod. With a swift, practiced motion, Dorian yanked the velvet cloth away. It crumpled to the marble floor with a soft, heavy thud. The silence that followed was not the awestruck hush of reverence Dorian had cultivated for 30 years. It was the sharp, violent intake of breath from 300 people simultaneously experiencing profound, paralyzing shock. For 3 agonized seconds, nobody moved. On the easel, illuminated by hundreds of thousands of watts of harsh, unforgiving light, sat Matteo, Vane's abomination. The saint's face was twisted into a grotesque, elongated sneer, resembling a caricature of a frightened horse rather than ecstatic devotion. The robes were painted in a shockingly vibrant, chemical blue that clashed violently with the dull, muddy browns of the background. The craquelure, the fine web of cracks that Zinnia had so proudly touted, looked as if it had been scrawled on by a child with a thick black marker. It was a staggering, insulting parody of Renaissance art. It was a joke. A single, nervous laugh bubbled up from a French curator in the second row, quickly stifled by the suffocating tension. Zinnia's smile shattered. Her mouth fell open in a silent scream of sheer, unadulterated horror. The blood drained from her face, leaving her complexion the color of ash. She stumbled backward, her high heel catching on the hem of her crimson gown, her eyes frantically darting from the monstrous painting to the crowd, and finally, to Dorian. "Dorian," she choked out, her voice a reedy, panicked whisper. What is this?" Florentine had dropped his glass. The crystal shattered loudly against the marble, a splash of amber liquid staining his black shoes. He pushed off the pillar, his face pale and contorted with fury and absolute panic. He stared at the easel as if a corpse had just been presented to him. This wasn't his forgery. This was garbage. "A tragedy," Dorian announced, his voice booming through the microphone, cutting through the rising tide of murmurs and camera flashes. He did not look at the painting. He looked only at his wife. "A profound, heartbreaking tragedy, ladies and gentlemen." Zinnia lunged forward, her hands hovering uselessly over the hideous canvas. "It's a mistake. The transport. Aegis must have. There's been a mix-up." She spun toward the crowd, her voice shrill, bordering on hysterical. "Please, this is not the piece. This is a joke." "It is indeed a joke, Zinnia," Dorian said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm. The room froze again. "But not the one you intended to play on me." He pulled a folded piece of paper from the inside pocket of his velvet jacket. It was the certificate of authenticity he had signed days ago. "I authenticated a painting," Dorian declared to the room, though his eyes never left his wife's crumbling facade. "A magnificent, technically flawless forgery. A canvas painted with synthetic lead white, baked in an industrial oven in San Frediano, and designed to steal €2 million from the very people standing in this room." Zinnia gasped, staggering back as if she had been physically struck. "Dorian, stop," she shrieked, tears of sheer panic ruining her immaculate makeup. "A forgery painted by Florentine Rossi," Dorian continued, pointing a trembling, damning finger at the young artist, who was now frozen, surrounded by glaring, horrified collectors. "And orchestrated, financed, and facilitated by my wife, through an offshore account in the Cayman Islands containing exactly €2.4 million of illicit funds." The Palazzo Vecchio erupted. The hall descended into absolute, deafening bedlam. Camera shutters clicked in a blinding, stroboscopic frenzy, capturing the exact moment the golden couple of Florence disintegrated. Wealthy collectors backed away from the stage as if the grotesque painting radiating beneath the spotlights carried a lethal contagion. Zinnia was trembling so violently that the diamonds at her throat clattered against her collarbone. Her survival instinct, honed by years of navigating the cutthroat, patriarchal art market, flared in a final, desperate burst. "He is unwell," she shrieked, her voice tearing through the cavernous room, shrill and grating. She pointed a manicured, shaking finger at Dorian, her eyes wide with a manufactured, pleading terror. "My husband is suffering from a paranoid breakdown. There is no forgery. There is no offshore account. He is deeply jealous of Florentine's rising talent and has orchestrated this sick humiliation to destroy us both." She turned to the Parisian curators, reaching out with frantic, grasping hands. "You know him. You know his mind has been slipping." Florentine, however, did not possess Zinnia's ironclad nerve. The young painter was backed against a marble column, his chest heaving. When he looked at the crowd, he didn't see sympathetic buyers. He saw prison sentences. He saw the end of his life before it had even truly begun. "Tell them, Florentine," Zinnia pleaded, reaching her hand out toward her lover. "Tell them he's lying." Florentine stared at her, then at Dorian, who was standing by the podium with the serene, untouchable stillness of a marble monument. "The boy broke. She forced me," Florentine shouted, his voice cracking, suddenly sounding like the terrified 26-year-old he was. He threw his hands up in surrender, backing toward the arched exit. "It was her idea. She supplied the traditional pigments. She manipulated the Sienese family. I just painted what she told me to paint." She said Dorian was an aging fool, that he would sign anything she put in front of him if she smiled. The betrayal echoed off the ancient frescoes, silencing the crowd for a fraction of a second. Zinnia recoiled, clutching her chest as if Florentine had driven a physical blade between her ribs. The brilliant, ruthless estate manager realized in that singular, agonizing heartbeat that the boy she had risked everything for, the passionate lover she was ready to flee to the Amalfi Coast with, was nothing but a selfish coward. Dorian watched the lovers tear each other apart, feeling the last, lingering shred of his marriage dissolve into dust. He stepped away from the microphone and reached into the inner pocket of his velvet jacket. He withdrew a thick, leather-bound folder. Bank statements, wire transfers, and transcripts of encrypted messages detailing the creation of 3 separate, forged works over the past 2 years, Dorian announced, his voice carrying an unnatural, chilling calm that cut through the hysteria. He did not hand the folder to the press. Instead, he stepped down from the stage and walked toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. The crowd of elite socialites parted for him like the Red Sea, their eyes wide with morbid fascination. Standing at the threshold were 4 men in immaculate dark uniforms, the gold insignia of the Comando Carabinieri per la tutela del Patrimonio Culturale, the Italian art police, gleaming on their lapels. Dorian had called them 3 hours before the gala, submitting himself and his trust to a full federal investigation. "Capitano," Dorian said quietly, handing the heavy folder to the lead officer. "You will find everything you need in there. The true forgery, the Botticelli, is secured in the trunk of my vehicle. The keys are with my driver at the front entrance." The officer took the folder with a grim nod and gestured to his men. As the Carabinieri moved purposefully toward the stage, Zinnia collapsed to her knees, the crimson silk pooling around her on the cold marble floor like blood. She didn't look at the police moving to apprehend Florentine. She looked only at Dorian, her dark eyes hollowed out, entirely broken. "You destroyed yourself just to ruin me," she whispered, the words barely audible over the rising sirens echoing from the piazza outside. "Your reputation, your legacy, your entire life's work. It's all gone, Dorian. You have nothing." Dorian looked down at the woman he had loved, feeling the terrible, crushing weight of her words. He had burned his own temple to the ground just to ensure she burned in the flames. "I know," Dorian replied softly. The dawn over Florence was the color of a bruised peach, casting a cold, flat light through the arched windows of the Palazzo Vecchio. The Grand Hall, mere hours ago the epicenter of the international art world, was now a silent, sterile crime scene. Yellow tape crisscrossed the marble columns. The string quartet was gone, leaving only the faint scent of stale champagne and spilled bourbon. Dorian stood alone in the center of the vast, echoing space. He was still wearing his midnight blue velvet dinner jacket, though the immaculate bow tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck like a broken collar. Zinnia and Florentine were currently in separate holding cells at the Carabinieri headquarters. The Italian press had already printed the morning editions. The headlines were screaming across Europe, "The Fall of Florence's Golden Couple. Dorian's masterpiece of deceit. A forgery of the heart." The trust's assets had been frozen before midnight. The Sienese family had threatened catastrophic lawsuits. Dorian had surrendered his passport and his bank records to the Capitano, accepting the inevitable federal charges for his complicity in transporting fraudulent goods. He had knowingly authenticated a forgery. The nuance of his revenge did not matter to the law. He had wielded his reputation as a weapon, and the recoil had shattered him. He was 62 years old, and he would never walk into a gallery, a museum, or a university lecture hall as a respected scholar again. He was a pariah, a ruined man. He walked slowly toward the heavy oak easel. Matteo Vane's grotesque caricature of St. Catherine still sat beneath the harsh, unblinking spotlights, an absurd monument to the destruction of 3 lives. Dorian reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and withdrew a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored parchment. It was a duplicate of the certificate of authenticity, the document he had signed in his library, the seal of the Zinnia and Dorian Art Estate Trust pressed deep into the red wax. It was the physical manifestation of his lie, the bait that had trapped his wife and destroyed his soul. He stared at his own elegant signature. For 30 years, that ink had been the final word on truth and beauty. It had validated the genius of long-dead masters and elevated the careers of the living. Now, it was nothing more than a testament to his own profound foolishness. He had spent his life studying the layers of paint, the subtle brushstrokes that separated a genuine emotion from a calculated imitation. Yet, he had failed to recognize the forgery in his own bed until it was too late. Dorian reached into his pocket again and produced a silver Zippo lighter. The sharp, metallic click echoed loudly in the empty hall. He flicked the wheel, a bright, steady flame illuminating the deep lines etched into his face. He held the bottom corner of the parchment to the flame. The heavy paper caught instantly, the fire consuming the watermarked crest of their trust, crawling up toward his signature. He watched the black ink curl and blister, the red wax seal melting and dripping onto the cold marble floor like a tear of blood. He held it until the heat blistered his fingertips, then dropped the burning remains onto the floor. He watched the ash flutter and die, the final piece of his legacy disintegrating into gray dust. The profound, suffocating silence of the hall pressed in on him. There was no triumph. There was no joy in seeing the woman who betrayed him hauled away in handcuffs. There was only this vast, echoing emptiness. He looked up at the grotesque painting one last time, the absurd blue robes and the elongated, mocking face of the saint staring back at him. It was a perfect reflection of his marriage. Dorian turned his back on the easel and began the long walk toward the heavy oak doors, his footsteps hollow and solitary against the ancient stone. He stepped out into the crisp, morning air of the Piazza della Signoria, a ruined man walking into the ruins of his own life. Art is supposed to imitate life, Zinnia, Dorian whispered to the empty, waking city. Both of yours were nothing but cheap forgeries.